Hey, do you know that in Adobe Lightroom there are 5 tools which, if you master them, your photo editing possibilities become virtually limitless? We're going to look at what those tools are in this video.
Hey, I'm Mitchell. For the past decade I've been living my dream, journeying around the world as a professional travel photographer. During this time, I've seen and I've learned a lot. And now I want to share the knowledge with you. Come along on the journey.
Hello again. If you watched the announcement last week, you will know that I'm currently launching a brand new educational resource. That's part of the reason why I'm sharing these videos on photo processing, photo editing, and I'll be sharing them throughout the month. The package that I'm talking about is, of course, my light-based Lightroom presets and the photo editing training videos. Because of the launch, the package is currently on a very special offer at 50% off. The launch and the offer end on January 1st. Now, the sorts of tips that you'll see in this video, there are many more similar ones in the photo editing training videos part of the package, and I'll go into them in much more depth and detail. There are also over 40 light-based presets. To see what light-based means, you'll have to follow the link on the screen or in the description. And there are a few more free tips on that page too. Anyway, here I am in this beautiful foresty part, just outside of the room that I'm renting. I'm gonna get back to the room and begin there. What is the single most important tool in Lightroom? I'll say that it's the tone curve. It's usually the first tool that I turn to, and I use it on every single image that I edit. You can use it to add contrast and a sense of drama. You can brighten darker tones with it, or darken brighter tones. You can change the overall feel of an image using only the tone curve. Sometimes the tone curve is the only tool that I use, and you can use it in a way which is as simple or as complex as you want. Highlights, shadows. Highlights and shadows are a great tool, but it's very important to understand its impact in relation to other tools. Usually these sliders are very interconnected with the exposure and the tone curve. Anyway, let me show you a very common way in which I use the highlights and shadow tool with this photo. First, I tweak the tone curve. This instantly makes the portrait more dynamic. I like the overall feel, but the shadow areas are getting a bit too dark. So this is where the shadows slider comes in. A slight raise in the value and I'm good. I could do something similar with just the curve. I'll undo the adjustment and show you. But you can see that like this, it takes more tweaking, more time. With the shadows slider, it's quicker and more efficient. Here's a more complex example. The contrast is high, and when you're shooting a scene like this, you have to sacrifice a bit of either the highlights or the shadows while exposing. In this case, for the sake of not losing detail in the clouds, I underexposed the darker areas, which include the faces. Maybe a little too much, but I knew that I was still within the range where I could easily recover the detail in the shadow areas. Here's the image with all the adjustments. Shadows brought up to +50. As a rule, I generally don't let the number in this slider go beyond +50, and in the highlights below -50. A value higher than 50 starts to make the image look HDR-ish, in that unrealistic kind of way. I explain this in more detail in my photo editing training videos, and I will expand on the topic just a little later on. To brighten the dark areas more, I also slightly raised the value in exposure. That made the clouds a little too bright, so I brought down the value in the highlights. The whole process is a bit of a balancing act. Once you adjust one slider, other sliders might need to be readjusted. I used the tone curve to further brighten the darker areas by raising it here, and I made the mid to bright tones a bit more subdued by making a point here and bringing it down. There are different ways to achieve similar results. I think that this one is the best and the fastest. Here is a version I created using only the tone curve. But look at how many points I needed on the curve. There was quite a bit of fiddling and more time spent. Also, while this result is comparable, this version has a few more nuances and a bit more detail in parts where I wanted. Now, another version. This is the look which I referred to as HDR-ish. It is colorful and there's a lot of detail in the brighter and the darker areas, but we don't actually have highlights or shadows anymore. Everything is sort of in the middle. This is not realistic. In life, there are shadows and highlights, and in a photo, we need them to create a sense of depth. This is a much more realistic looking photo. It might still need a few more tweaks, but this is headed in the right direction. Now, what if you do want something, a detail in a photo to look brighter or darker? If you can't just go all the way with the shadows and highlights, then what? This is where local adjustments come in. So far, the tools that I've been talking about have been global adjustments. They apply your tweaks to the entire image. Local adjustments apply the tweaks only to the parts of the image that you select. The next two tools are all about local adjustments. The Radial Filter. The Radial Filter is my favorite local adjustment tool. Before this tool was released, I used the brush tool a lot. But the Radial Filter can achieve the same things and in a faster and more neat manner. With a newer feature that I'll talk about towards the end of the video, the Radial Filter tool has become even more precise and more powerful than ever before. I'll start with this example and I'll show you a very simple use of the Radial Filter. I've already tweaked the tone curve here to make the image look more dynamic. It was made at sunset, so I wanted vivid colors and darker shadows. I did raise the overall value of the shadows a little because they were getting slightly too dark, but I didn't want to raise it anymore. Remember, in life, we do have dark areas and we have shadows. And in photos, we need them to create that sense of depth. So, Radial Filter. Then I select or make sure that Invert Mask is selected. And I draw a Radial Filter mask over this man's face. If I bring the cursor here, the red indicates where the effect will be applied to. I can also click this to do the same. And I'll often raise the value in feather just to make sure that the transition between the inside of the mask and the outside is a little smoother. I want to brighten the face, so I unselect this and I bring up the exposure a little bit and the shadows too. That looks pretty good, realistic. Fast forwarding to this photo with a couple more tweaks. Radial Filter mask over the hand. Only increased the value in the shadows for this one. And I drew a little Radial Filter mask over the eye and brightened it by raising the value in the exposure. So here's my adjusted image. And here's the one before the adjustment. I'll now show you an example with numerous subtle adjustments. Here I also adjusted the tone curve to make the photo look more dynamic and punchy. But this had an effect on the brightest and the darkest parts of the image. Remember, making tweaks to an image is a balancing act. So I adjusted the highlights and the shadows of the whole image a little bit. But what I really need is to adjust specific elements. This book is a bit too bright. This man's robe too. And this part here draws more attention than it deserves, in my opinion. The hands are a tiny bit too dark, as is the face. So, here's the adjusted version. Radial filter mask over the book. Highlights brought down. Now the book is not too bright. Same thing with this man's robe. And here too. Now the hands, just radial filter mask and raised the shadows for both of them. With this man's face though, I slightly raised the value in the shadows and in clarity. Increasing the clarity makes an element stand out a little from the surrounding area. I raised the value of feather too to make the transition smoother. Zoom out. And here's the image before all the local adjustments and after. We can do even more with the radial filter. I'll get to that in just a bit. But before then, I want to show you another local adjustment tool which I think is very, very useful. The graduated filter. Let me show you an ideal situation for this tool right away. Something like this. I've already made most of my adjustments, but there was more detail in the sky and the clouds looked more dramatic. So, graduated filter tool. I pull it over the sky like this. I'm going to click Show Selected Mask Overlay. And you can see that this red area fades towards the bottom like a graduated filter on a camera would. This means that the effect's strength gradually fades, which is very convenient in a landscape image like this. I want the adjustments to be intense around the sky area and much less so around the mountains. I'll turn this off, bring down the exposure, and the clouds are darker now, and you can see that this part here, the transition between the darkened area and the untouched area is smooth and it's pretty much unnoticeable. Here's another example with the same idea and another one. Now a totally different type of image, but it's also very suitable for the graduated filter because this whole part is very dark and needs brightening, and this part here doesn't. This is the result of the graduated filter. I've brightened the dark part and the adjustment gradually fades towards the area which did not need to be adjusted. Before the graduated filter and after. So when there's a sort of a fairly straight imaginary line between the area which needs to be adjusted and the one which doesn't, the graduated filter is perfect. But what do we do about something that isn't really a straight line? Something more irregular, like this. I've already made some adjustments and now I want to get the sky and the clouds looking just right. But you see, this cloud is almost on the same level as this woman's face. This is going to be an issue. Of course, I will show you how to deal with it. I create a graduated filter mask and bring down the exposure. To get the lower clouds looking darker, I do need to drag the mask all the way here. The sky looks pretty good, but this woman's face is way too dark, as I expected. This is where one of the most game-changing tools comes in. Let me show you this tool in action right away. I enter the graduated filter mask, and this is the tool I'm talking about. Range mask. You can choose either color or luminance here. I mostly choose luminance, but I'll show you how you can use the color option as well. So luminance and then show luminance mask, As always, the red is the area which will be affected by the adjustments. As I drag this slider, I'm actually selecting a range of tones, brighter tones in this case. I can tweak this slider as well to make the transition smoother, but here I'll leave it at 50. Now I'll switch this off. And you can notice right away that the woman's face is not as dark anymore. And the sky is actually looking even better. Here's the previous version. The woman's face is clearly much darker here. And you can see that by comparison, the blue part of the sky was too dark. Back to the new version. And here I've just been able to apply my adjustments in a much more precise way. Pretty much only to the parts of the frame which were too bright. When Adobe came out with the Range Mask tool, it was instantly a game changer for situations like these. In my preset collection, there are a few special presets just for the sky and for the ground, with all of the right settings and just the right tonal range selected. Now, normally I would brighten this woman's face, but I'll leave this image and take you to this one. It's a better example of where more precise adjustments need to be made to the face. So here also most of the adjustments have already been applied, except the face is obviously too dark because of the shadow from the hat. I'm fast forwarding and here we can perfectly see the detail in the area where the shadow falls. The idea behind these adjustments is the same as with the bright sky. Except in this case I used the Radial Filter. I selected Range Mask, Luminance, and I chose only the darkest tones for adjustment. This gave me that precision that I talked about. By contrast, here's a version where I simply drew a Radial Filter mask and applied exactly the same adjustments within the entire mask, not only to the dark range of tones. And you can see that this way it looks much more sloppy. So, no adjustments. Adjustments within the entire Radial Filter mask, and adjustments to only the dark tones within the Radial Filter mask. I did say that you can use the Range Mask and choose color. I'll demonstrate with this image. Most of the adjustments are already applied, and what I want to do is subdue the bright orange shirts of these men because they draw too much attention. This is my result. I'll break down what I did. I drew a Radial Filter mask, chose Range Mask, and here I chose color. I grabbed this color range selector, and there are various ways to select colors. You can hold the Shift key and click on the colors you want, and you can choose up to 5 colors this way. Or you can choose a range of colors by selecting an area. That's what I did here, and then I darkened and desaturated my selection. I experimented with these sliders to make the transition between the affected area and the area around it smoother, and I do encourage you to always experiment with them too. This is the image before the adjustments and after. A pretty quick and a precise way of getting attention away from a very eye-catching and bright element.
In my new educational resource, I go into many more of the kinds of examples that you've seen in this video, and I go into them in much more depth. We'll even practice mastering all the tools through the included exercises, using the raw files which you can download. If you are interested in this new resource, the light-based presets and the photo editing training videos, well then, once again, the special launch offer is on until January 1st. While it's on, you can save 50%. Check out the link on the screen, and it's also in the description. So those were the 5 Lightroom tools which, if you master them, will lead you to limitless photo editing possibilities. That's all for today. Make sure to stay tuned for the next video next week. There will be many more useful photo editing tips in that one, and goodbye for now.